In this video, we're going to focus on the four eras or periods of classical music. They are the Baroque, Classical, Romantic, and Contemporary.
Let's start with the Baroque, shall we?
The Baroque era of music lasted from around 1600 to 1750. Think of kings and queens and royalty and very fancy people doing very fancy things.
It's like 400 years ago.
That would be like your grandparents' parents' parents' parents would have been alive back then. Like, they could have been like hanging out with Johann Sebastian Bach. Men wore wigs and tights, and women dressed in fancy dresses. Now, it's important to note that the Catholic Church was a very powerful influence in people's lives and very important for musicians. In fact, most musicians were considered musical servants, and composers like Bach, Vivaldi, and Handel, they wrote classical music for services, church services, and special occasions for like royal ceremonies and stuff like that, for fancy parties. Now, during the Baroque era, composers mainly wrote music for religious services, and also music for dancing and entertainment, and it was performed in the church, and it was performed at wealthy people's homes. Now, however, during the end of the Baroque era, opera started becoming a little more popular, and opera houses started popping up. So, to sum up the Baroque period, it was roughly from the years between 1600 and 1750. Think of like kings and queens and fancy people trying to outdo each other. And musicians were the musical servants of the day. They were servants to the church, and they wrote mainly religious music, but they also wrote music for dancing and entertainment for people who were wealthy and would perform those pieces that they wrote in the church and in the homes of those of the wealthy. But it's also important to note that opera, which is telling stories with music and acting, became more popular, and opera houses started to become fashionable. So, what next? Well, next came the classical period, or era, and that was roughly from around 1750 to 1820. Now, that's about 300 years ago. And imagine if everyone lived to be 100 years old, that would be your grandparents' parents' parents. They could have been hanging out with Mozart. Not too shabby. People of that time wanted a change from the Baroque period. They thought, oh God, it's just so odd and dated, and who wants to listen to that? And composers during the classical period wrote music that was much less complex and not drawn out. And so during the classical period, Europe, and specifically countries like Austria, Germany, and Italy, were like the epicenter of where all the fashion and style and music were happening, and it attracted the best composers and the most talented musicians. And because travel and communication between these countries became easier and more efficient, this style flourished and became widely successful and popular. Now, during this time, it's important to note that composers started to break away from being just solely employed by the church. They were able to make a living writing for wealthy aristocrats who wanted to be entertained. So that's a very important distinction during the classical period, is that this new way of making a living for composers emerged. And this nobility and these wealthy became the primary patrons or supporters of this music. So, to sum up the classical period, it was roughly from around 1750 to 1820, and people wanted a change from the fanciness of the Baroque style. And composers from Austria, Germany, and Italy were the most talented and the most widely respected composers of that time. And because of the communications and the travel that was becoming easier between those countries, musicians were able to make a living not being supported just by the church, but by wealthy patrons and by aristocrats who would pay them to perform and write music for their special occasions.
That brings us to the Romantic period, which was from 1820 to around 1900.
During this time, there was a lot of changes, and composers no longer depended on the church or the wealthy necessarily to provide their financial support. So composers were performers, they were teachers, they were conductors, they were music critics, and they made quite a decent living, some of them, publishing their music. Composers
wrote a lot of music that would express their emotions and feelings during this time, and it was a very individualistic style, and composers were very unique in that sense, where they were really trying to strive to have their own unique voice rather than fit in with a style that had already previously been established. Countries like Russia, France, Spain, and America became important countries for classical music and its progress. So many of these composers would use folk music and melodies and rhythms and the stories and the history of their native land for inspiration. And we would call that nationalism. So nationalistic composers used their country's folk music, their stories, and the history as inspiration. Then there were some composers who would use paintings as inspiration to write their music. And this music, they had vague outlines of the melodies and rhythms, and it was much more subtle, and it was more fuzzy, kind of giving a fuzzy picture for the audience. And this was known as Impressionism. So Impressionistic composers created music that created a vague picture with its sound. So, to sum up the Romantic period, from roughly 1820 to 1900, composers really no longer depended on the church or just the wealthy to support them. They were able to become teachers and performers and conductors and critics, and they made money publishing their music. During the Romantic era, composers wrote music that expressed their feelings and emotions. That was the primary drive, to really kind of be individual and unique and kind of be able to express that to others. Nationalistic composers used the country's folk music and melodies and stories as inspiration. And Impressionistic composers created music that painted a vague picture with its sound.
Finally, we get to the contemporary era. So if we were to take a time machine back about 100 years, the contemporary period or era of music is from 1900 to about 2000. Composers were searching for new ways of making music. They, just like in the other periods, it was a reaction to the styles that had come before and the sounds that had come before. And some composers were trying to expand on what was done, and others were really trying to invent something completely new. So, new electronic sounds and new ways of composing melodies and using rhythms made for some very interesting music. So, because these new ideas would be able to be communicated much faster than they had in the past, change was occurring much more rapidly. So composers wrote music for a wide variety of reasons and purposes. And as classical music's audience was becoming more diverse, composers wrote widely diverse music as well. So, to sum up the contemporary era, roughly 1900 to 2000, composers were searching for new ways of creating music. And some were very interested in expanding on what had been done before, while others were very interested in inventing something completely new. And because these new ideas were able to be communicated quicker than in the past, this change was happening more rapidly. And we see more variety. And as the classical music's audience was becoming more diverse, composers were also composing in a much more diverse way. Whew! So there you have it. Those are the four main periods or eras that helped to define classical music and its sound. The Baroque, classical, Romantic, and contemporary. Each unique and each very important in its own special way that helped to produce a sound and help produce masterpieces that are timeless and classic and that we still hear today and that we still study today and that still impact our lives.